Welcome to today's Explainer. Look, we're doing something a bit different right now. We're stepping way back from the anxiety of the daily news cycle to conduct a truly objective, structural review of what our source material calls a global geographic motherboard. We're looking at the deep, underlying positioning of Iran. The analysis we're diving into today argues that to actually understand this region, we have to look right past the temporary, chaotic political anomalies of the present moment. Instead, we need to examine the deep environmental physics and the rock-solid long-term economic realities that define it.
Here's the roadmap for where we're headed. We'll hit the false geopolitical binary, the archetype of the ancient magi, and thermodynamics and the matrix. Then we'll navigate cosmic polarity, look at the silent general strike, and wrap up with the idea of a West Asian Japan. All right, let's just jump right in.
Section 1. The false geopolitical binary.
So the source points out a pretty massive flaw in how global media talks about this region. You know the standard narrative, right? It's completely obsessed with this East versus West alignment. It frames everything as, oh, Iran is sliding into Eastern economic spheres, or they're pushing back against the West through proxy wars. But the structural reality? It's entirely different. It's actually a lot deeper. Iran is not just a piece being moved around on somebody else's chessboard. It literally is the chessboard. It's this immovable, central civilizational weight, an incredibly deep geographic matrix that simply cannot be permanently absorbed into another empire's orbit.
Putting on our global economist hat for a second. The current political maneuvering we see, the source clinically diagnoses it as an artificial, high-entropy anomaly. Basically, the current ruling factions aren't some permanent, unshakable state. They're more like a dogmatic virus. They consume a ton of energy without actually producing any real value. Sure, right now external empires are trying to use this anomaly as an asymmetrical tool. It's part of the broader Thucydides Trap between rising global powers and the current rulers. But, and this is absolutely crucial, there are limits to Chinese proxy control. Beijing's extremely logical calculus is eventually going to hit a wall. They won't tolerate these unpredictable ideological pests forever. I mean, you can't have rogue elements threatening vital subsea data cables and the strategic choke points that literally feed global trade to India and the West. Long term, the math of global commerce just won't allow it.
Moving on to Section 2. The archetype of the ancient magi. So what's the real, scientifically minded root of this population's incredible resilience? Well, the source points us to the archetype of the ancient magi. And no, forget the pop culture image of mysterious magicians waving wands. The root of the word itself is fundamentally tied to the human brain and the act of measuring. These early thinkers were basically conducting advanced metallurgy, while a huge chunk of the rest of the world was still in the Stone Age. We're talking about a highly data-driven demographic. They mapped the constellations and harnessed the Earth's crust using pure, unadulterated logic.
And this brilliant engineering mindset didn't just pop out of nowhere. It was a direct product of environmental physics. When early human migrations moved out of Africa, they eventually hit the high, thin-air topography of the Iranian plateau. Think about what that means. That elevation gave them an absolutely unobstructed view of the macrocosm above. It was literally a unique environmental laboratory. These early thinkers could clearly observe the four elements and the patterns of life. That environment essentially forced them to develop the empirical logic necessary to decode absolute physical laws, rather than just shrugging and blaming the universe on arbitrary whims.
Which brings us to Section 3. Thermodynamics and the matrix.
So how exactly does prehistoric observation map onto modern physics? It's fascinating. The source links the ancient concept of Ameshasepanta and this idea of eternal balance called Asha directly to the first and second laws of thermodynamics. It essentially frames the cosmos exactly like a modern electrical battery. You have Ahura Mazda acting as the positive terminal. That's order, light, constructive creation. And directly opposing it is Ihurman, the negative terminal. That's chaos, change, decay. You absolutely need both to generate a current. The dialectical tension between these positive and negative forces is quite literally what creates the fabric of existence.
And honestly, this perfectly illustrates the ancient understanding that energy cannot be created or destroyed. Through entropy, the universe is just in this perpetual, necessary state of transformation. The source makes a really great point here. Humanity survived 4 major global climate shifts. How? Not through rigid dogma, but by relying on hardcore empirical logic and maintaining a really deep respect for this cosmic change.
All right, Section 4. Navigating cosmic polarity.
To actually handle all this binary friction, ancient Iranians developed a really structured cognitive framework. Now, we've all heard the maxim, good thoughts, good words, good deeds, right? But the source analyzes this as way more than just a nice moral code. It's actually a dialectical mechanism. Think of it like this. Step 1. Good thoughts. That's managing the raw friction of opposing forces in your mind to distill a pure synthesis. Step 2. Good words. Taking that balanced internal energy and formulating it into clean communication. And then step 3. Good deeds. Actually manifesting those balanced words into physical reality on the material plane. At every single stage, opposing forces have to be actively balanced. It's a heavy-duty cognitive tool, and as we'll see, it's one the modern population still relies on today to outlast temporary ideological occupations.
And this geometric code of balance, it is literally carved into stone. The source highlights that the ancient carvings at Susa depicted these human-animal hybrids facing in completely opposite directions. It permanently encodes the mathematical law of balanced opposing forces right into the region's mountain walls. You know, it doesn't matter how many physical libraries were burned down by expanding empires throughout history, this empirical scientific reasoning always survived because it was inherently rewritten into the landscape itself.
Let's move on to Section 5, the silent general strike.
Okay, so how does this ancient systems philosophy apply to what's happening right now? Well, the source analyzes the current regime in Iran not as some permanent, immovable fixture, far from it. It's viewed as a structural remnant, basically a lingering hangover from the extreme social and climatic disruptions caused by the Mongol invasion centuries ago. Clinically speaking, it's diagnosed as a temporary virus that is actively ignoring those foundational laws of physics we just talked about. And the way the population is responding is incredibly strategic. It's super fascinating to note that this is the exact same secular, mathematically gifted demographic that consistently crushes it at global math Olympiads. They are fighting back by wearing the ancient Faravahar symbol as a code of clean, constructive energy. Day in and day out, they are completely bypassing forced state ideology. They're executing a peaceful, totally silent general strike. They are literally starving the parasitic system of its power, all while the engineers quietly maintain the real technical machinery of the country right under the radar. It's absolutely brilliant.
Which brings us to our sixth and final section, the West Asian Japan.
Now we're faced with a massive structural question. What actually happens to the global geopolitical chessboard when this civilizational motherboard inevitably initiates its system restore? Once this dogmatic virus is totally starved out, what kind of economic reality is going to take its place?
The source draws a really sharp contrast here. Right now, the current status is an isolated ideological backyard that serves as a passive proxy for external empires. But its structural destiny, the inevitable future that the hard data points to, it's a fiercely competitive, fully independent industrial hub. The text actually recalls an older economic dream, building an ultra-cheap, highly educated nearshoring hub that perfectly bridges Europe and Asia, a model it refers to as a West Asian Japan.
Just consider the underlying economic fundamentals for a second. You've got a geography bordering Europe with virtually endless energy resources. Pair that with a highly educated, deeply secular workforce that is absolutely starving for real, unhindered global commerce. And here's the crazy part. Global tech partners and major international firms are already actively bypassing the ideological hardliners. They are going straight to the source, dealing directly with this scientific workforce. So this West Asian Japan model, it isn't just some theoretical pipe dream. The infrastructure is already booting up.
Ultimately, the source concludes that the laws of physics don't belong to any single empire. Just think about how the West spent 3 centuries fighting its own religious dogma to rediscover the universal laws of the cosmos. Science and reason will definitively reclaim this motherboard too. The text forecasts that any dogmatic remnants will inevitably melt away in this civilizational crucible. Eventually, they'll just be relegated to an isolated, powerless little zone, something the author likens to a Vatican of calm.
Which leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought. If the laws of thermodynamics dictate that energy absolutely always outlasts entropy, how much longer can global markets and geopolitical analysts pretend that a 3,000-year-old scientific matrix won't overwrite a temporary ideological virus? It completely challenges us to rethink our investment timelines and strategic outlooks. We need to frame the future not around short-term, high-anxiety dogma, but around the undeniable long-term victory of math and structural physics. All right, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the headlines, and I'll see you next time.